She was just a cleaning lady. Until she taught 9 languages to the millionaire's son. Sounds impossible, doesn't it? But what happened inside that luxurious mansion behind heavy doors and silent hallways forever changed the life of a cold man, a lonely child, and a woman everyone preferred to ignore. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Helen arrived at the Blackwood mansion carrying nothing but a worn-out backpack and a silence heavier than the world. No one knew where she came from, nor why her eyes seemed to hold too many stories for such a calm face. Among the staff, she was invisible. She did her tasks with precision, never raising her voice, never shifting her gaze. Yet there was something about her, an unexplainable presence, as if she were always waiting for someone to notice what even she dared not show. But what could a simple cleaner possibly teach the son of one of the richest men in the country? That question echoed through the corridors of that house, maybe even inside you right now. The answer was simple, and at the same time, surprising. Helen had something money could not buy. She had listening, she had time, she had soul. And Daniel, the millionaire's son, didn't need more therapies or expensive toys. He needed someone who spoke to him not just with words, but with the heart. And, unbelievably, that connection was born when no one expected it. It began the moment Helen was sweeping the floor and softly started singing in Italian. Inside that cold mansion, where everything was too perfect to feel human, an invisible woman lit the first spark of life in a boy everyone else had already given up on. Since losing his mother, Daniel hadn't spoken a single word. Everyone in the Blackwood mansion knew this, but few truly understood the weight of his silence. Some speculated about trauma, diagnoses, emotional blocks. Others simply labeled him as the strange son of the boss. But no one truly reached out, not the elite tutors from renowned schools, not the therapists recommended by the country's best specialists. The boy had built a castle within himself and locked every door. He wandered the enormous house like a delicate shadow, always silent, always alone. He spent hours in the playroom, his eyes fixed on children's books in multiple languages, Russian, French, Arabic, Spanish, as if someone had once tried to unlock him with every tongue in the world, hoping one might make him respond. But he never did, until he heard Helen's voice. It wasn't a lecture, nor a teaching attempt, just a song in Italian, soft and melodic, that she hummed absent-mindedly while cleaning the library window. It was an old tune from her childhood. She didn't know anyone was listening, but Daniel was there, hiding behind the bookshelf, his eyes fixed on her. He didn't approach that day, but something began to stir inside him. The next morning, while Helen cleaned the grand hall, she heard a faint sound coming from the staircase. A single word, whispered timidly. Luna, a word from the song. She turned slowly and saw Daniel peeking from behind the railing, his eyes shining in a way she would never forget. Helen said nothing. She simply smiled and, as if responding to a secret, whispered back in French, "Bonjour, Daniel." He smiled in return. That day, she finished work with a different weight in her chest. Not exhaustion, but the quiet certainty that something far greater was about to unfold. And she was right. The following day, Daniel appeared again. This time, he walked closer. He sat on the library floor, pulling one of the books that always surrounded him, a small blue one with pictures and words in Spanish. He pointed to a drawing of a cat and looked at Helen, waiting. She understood instantly. "Gio," she said softly. Then, pointing to the same picture, she added in French, "Chat." Daniel repeated the words with hesitation, but without fear, like someone discovering a new game. And right there, among expensive rugs and mahogany furniture, two worlds quietly collided. From that day on, Helen began spending more time near him, not breaking the rules, never delaying her duties, but always letting a word slip whenever Daniel was nearby. A glance, a small gesture, a soft syllable left floating in the air. And he responded, first with smiles, then with scattered words, in different languages. It was as if every new sound she gave him unlocked another hidden corner of the boy's heart. Some of the other staff noticed, but they said nothing. Maybe because they too felt something different happening, maybe out of fear. But one person didn't notice or chose not to. Edward Blackwood, Daniel's father. He was a busy man, always between trips, meetings, and decisions that seemed more important than anything inside his own home. His love for his son was real, but his absences were constant. To Edward, caring meant providing the best doctors, the best therapists, the best toys money could buy. It never once crossed his mind that the key to unlocking his son's silence might be in the hands of a woman like Helen, and perhaps that's why she kept it quiet. After all, it wasn't her role. She wasn't hired to teach. But she didn't do it out of duty. She did it because she understood, because she carried her own pain and recognized Daniel's without him ever having to say a word. One afternoon, while tidying up the library, Helen accidentally dropped a children's book in English. She pretended not to notice when Daniel picked it up and opened it. He didn't read the words, but he touched the pages with strange familiarity. Then, pointing at a star, he whispered, "Star." Helen almost laughed and cried at the same time. She held back the emotion and simply whispered back, "Very good." From then on, she alternated languages. A phrase while putting toys away, a word while dusting shelves. Never forcing, never demanding, just offering sounds. And Daniel received them with a thirst that surprised even himself. Day after day, word after word, the boy who had not spoken began to build a vocabulary in 9 different languages. But no one else knew. Not yet. And when they finally found out, they would not be ready to understand where such a transformation came from. Because sometimes healing doesn't come from medicine, degrees, or the highest experts. Sometimes it hides in the simplest gesture, the softest sound, or in the gaze of someone who dares to see what everyone else ignores. Helen was no longer invisible to Daniel, and at last he was beginning to find his own voice. Daniel never rushed, and Helen never pushed. They moved together, slowly, through a silent territory no one else dared to enter. It wasn't a traditional class. There was no blackboard, no rules. Just a cleaner, a boy, and a trust built without promises. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Helen arrived a bit earlier than usual. The mansion was still asleep. The only sound was the rain tapping against the glass. She opened the library door gently, as always, and found Daniel already waiting in his corner. In his hands was a red book she had forgotten on the table the day before. A book with simple, colorful words in German. Helen sat quietly on the floor, a respectful distance away. Daniel looked at her, then back to the page. "Cats," he whispered. Helen froze. Had she really heard it? But then Daniel repeated, adding, "Cat. Giatio." This time, her smile came from deep inside her soul. She didn't cheer loudly. She simply repeated with him like two people dancing to an old, familiar song. That day, no broom, no cleaning supplies were used. Instead, Helen spent hours sitting with Daniel, pointing at pictures, exchanging words, listening as he tried short sentences, sometimes in French, sometimes in Spanish, sometimes mixing languages as if searching for the safest path. But Helen wasn't the only one transforming. Each word Daniel spoke awakened something inside her that she thought was long gone. She remembered the woman she used to be, a linguistics professor teaching eager students in classrooms filled with tall windows. She remembered conferences, awards, her name printed in academic journals, until it all vanished. The fire at the university, the losses, the screams before the sirens. Then came widowhood, then the car accident that took her daughter. After that, she simply stopped. She left everything behind: titles, recognition, purpose. Cleaning houses was the only job she had strength for, and even then, she did it silently, hiding who she had once been. No one in the Blackwood mansion knew any of this, and Helen never told them. But maybe that's why she understood Daniel so well. He didn't need invasive questions or promises of quick progress. He needed someone who would see him not as a broken puzzle, but simply as a child. The 9 languages Daniel began to speak didn't come from some revolutionary method. They came from care, from the patience of a woman who knew when to insist and when to wait. It was like teaching music not just to the ears, but to the soul. And even though she knew she was crossing invisible boundaries, Helen couldn't stop. She wasn't doing it for recognition. She was doing it because Daniel reminded her of her daughter, the same curious eyes, the same way of inventing words. That fragile thread between pain and tenderness kept her steady. For weeks, Edward remained unaware. He continued his routine of endless meetings, flights, and investments, building walls around himself instead of facing what was inside his own home. He passed by Daniel as though the boy were a shadow, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. It was easier to believe his son was lost than to accept his own absence as part of the problem. But Daniel's progress could no longer remain hidden. His words flowed like a river once dammed too long. He was smiling more, moving with confidence, even leaving notes with words scribbled in multiple languages. Until one morning, fate decided not to wait any longer. Helen was in the library with Daniel. They sat on the floor surrounded by colorful cards, picture books, and a small whiteboard. They were laughing about food names, translating between Portuguese, French, and Arabic. Then the door opened. Daniel froze instantly. Helen turned. Edward Blackwood had walked in. He hadn't meant to intrude, it seemed accidental, but the look in his eyes betrayed something else. A mixture of exhaustion, suspicion, and something softer he couldn't yet admit. He stopped at the sight of them. Helen still held a card in her hand with the word apple written in 3 languages. Daniel lowered his gaze, trembling. What is going on here? Edward's voice was calm but sharp, calculated. Helen stood slowly, not out of fear but respect. She looked directly into his eyes, something few dared to do, and answered quietly, "We're learning together." "Learning?" He frowned, turning to his son. "Since when does my son speak?" Daniel's lips trembled. His eyes stayed down. Helen crouched beside him, whispering something in German. Daniel inhaled deeply, lifted his head with effort, and said, "Guten Tag, Papa." Time stopped. Edward staggered back a step, his eyes wide. His own son had spoken to him in German. He called me father," Edward murmured, stunned. He looked at Helen, shaken. "How long has this been happening?" "A little over a month," she replied. "It started with a song. Then small words." Daniel was never close to the world, he just didn't find a space where he was truly heard. Edward's eyes swept the room, the handmade cards, the simple whiteboard, the colorful books. It was all so basic, so ordinary, and yet more real than any of the expensive therapies he had invested in. "Why didn't you tell me?" he pressed. Helen hesitated. For a second, she almost looked away. Then she answered simply, "Because you never asked, and I didn't want to intrude on a space that wasn't mine." Silence stretched heavy between them. Daniel watched nervously, sensing something fragile about to break or to be born. Finally, Edward knelt down in front of his son. His voice cracked with both guilt and wonder. "You can really speak other languages?" Daniel nodded shyly. Then, in Portuguese, he whispered, "Helen taught me." For the first time, Edward heard his son say her name, and it sounded sacred. Edward straightened slowly, his gaze fixed on Helen. For the first time, there was no coldness in his expression, only 1,000 questions he didn't know how to voice. "I had no idea who you really were," he said finally. Helen didn't flinch. Her voice was steady. "Neither did I, until Daniel reminded me." She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. What existed between her and the boy could not be written in resumes or measured in expensive treatments. It was presence, listening, humanity. Edward left the library without another word. He didn't thank her. He didn't apologize. But when he glanced back at the door, he saw his son holding Helen's hand. And in that moment, he knew, whatever this was, it could not be interrupted. From that day on, something inside Edward shifted. He began noticing what he had ignored for years, the sound of Daniel's laughter echoing in the garden, the colorful notes tucked inside library books, the foreign words rolling easily off his son's tongue. But not everyone welcomed the change. Sandra, the head housekeeper for over 10 years, was the first to grow uneasy. For years, she had believed she was the only one who truly cared for Daniel, even if she had never been able to break his silence. And now, within weeks, Helen had done what no one else could. It stung more than she wanted to admit. One hot Saturday morning, she sought Edward in his office. Her tone was calculated, as it always was in delicate matters. "Sir, I need to speak with you about the new maid." Edward lifted his eyes from his laptop, unsurprised. He already knew who she meant. "Helen?" "Yes. I don't know if you've realized, but she has overstepped her boundaries. She's occupying a place that isn't hers. This closeness with Daniel, it may seem harmless, but it's dangerous. We don't know who she is, where she came from, or what she really wants." Edward studied her in silence. Once, he might have dismissed Helen instantly on Sandra's word alone, but something about her tone was off, not concern, but fear. Fear of losing control. "She gave my son his voice back," Edward replied coldly. "Do you have any idea what that means?" Sandra hesitated, then pressed on. "All the more reason to be cautious. I'm not saying she's done anything wrong. I'm saying we need to know exactly who we're letting influence Daniel. He's vulnerable, and she might be taking advantage of that." Edward leaned back, exhaling sharply. A part of him admitted Sandra wasn't entirely wrong. He didn't know Helen's past, but the insinuation cut deep because he had seen the truth in Daniel's eyes. "I'll speak to her," he said at last, "personally." That evening, Helen was tidying the library with Daniel when a staff member told her Edward wanted to see her in his office. Her heartbeat quickened. She had known this moment would come. She just didn't know how much of herself she was ready to reveal. When she entered, Edward stood by the window, his back to her. He turned only when she reached the door. "I need to know who you are, Helen." "The truth." She held his gaze calmly. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Where you came from. What you did before working here. Why you've kept it hidden." For a moment, she lowered her eyes, searching for words no one else had cared to hear in years. "I was a linguistics professor for more than 20 years, she said quietly. "I coordinated educational projects. I taught children, teenagers, adults. My daughter was the same age as Daniel. When she died after I'd already lost my husband, I couldn't go on. I left everything. The conferences, the research, the classrooms, all of it. I had nothing left to give." Edward's throat tightened. He hadn't expected that. "Why Daniel?" he asked after a pause. Helen's answer was simple, yet devastating. "Because he looked at me the same way my daughter used to. And because I saw in his eyes the same pain I carry in mine. I didn't go into that library to teach him. He was the one teaching me that something inside me hadn't died after all." For a long moment, silence filled the office. Then Edward pulled out a chair and gestured softly. "Sit." For the first time, they sat across from each other, not as employer and servant, but as two broken people who had somehow met at the right time. "What do you expect from all this?" he asked. Helen hesitated. Then, with quiet conviction, "I expect nothing. I only want Daniel to keep growing. I don't want him to be stopped by fear, jealousy, or conventions." Edward leaned back, absorbing her words. He was facing a woman who had quietly changed everything without permission, without recognition, and without asking for anything in return. "I don't want you to leave," he said finally, "but perhaps it's time to give a new name to what you've been doing here." Helen didn't answer. She didn't need to. They both knew her role had already transformed into something far greater. The days after that conversation in Edward's office felt different. Something in the mansion's air had shifted. No one spoke about it out loud, but everyone sensed it. Edward was no longer a shadow passing through the corridors. He lingered now, watching, listening, even sitting down at meals. Sometimes he stayed silent, but his presence alone was new, and Daniel was blossoming. He no longer hid in corners. He greeted staff shyly. He strung full sentences together. He mixed languages with playful ease, French with Portuguese, Spanish with English, and sometimes even taught the gardener or the cook little phrases he had learned from Helen. Words had become his bridge to the world, and Helen was the only one who knew how to guide him across it. One rainy afternoon, Edward made his decision. He asked for coffee to be set on the covered veranda and sent for Helen. She arrived wearing her uniform, still holding a cleaning cloth in her hand, suspicion in her eyes. But he gestured gently for her to sit. She hesitated, then obeyed. Edward stirred his coffee slowly, buying time before he spoke. "I've spoken with Daniel's school directors," he began. "They say his progress is extraordinary, months ahead in vocabulary and comprehension across several languages. They think we're using some kind of advanced program." Helen only smiled softly. She didn't explain. She never did. Edward looked down at his cup, exhaled, then met her eyes. "I've thought a lot about it, and I've decided you can't remain just the house cleaner. That role doesn't make sense anymore. What you've done for my son has no name, but it deserves its own place. I want to invite you to become Daniel's official tutor here at home, with all the support you need." Helen froze. Her fingers traced the edge of the cup, her gaze lowered. She didn't respond right away. When she finally did, her voice was quiet, heavy with meaning. "Does this change everything?" "It does," he admitted, "but you've already changed everything. I'm only trying to keep up." Helen raised her eyes, steady and firm. "I'll accept, but only under one condition. That Daniel be seen as a whole child, not a miracle, not a success story, not a project. Just a boy. He needs to grow in peace." Edward held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "That condition is more than fair." That night, Helen removed her uniform for the last time. She washed her hands slowly, as she did after every shift, and stared at her reflection in the small mirror of the servants' quarters. The face was the same, but the eyes were different, carrying back a piece of the woman she once was before grief had taken everything away. The next morning, Daniel welcomed her with pure joy. He ran into her arms, dragging her toward the new study room, what used to be Edward's office, now transformed into a classroom. On the whiteboard, words were written in 9 different languages. "Welcome, teacher." Daniel insisted on reading them all aloud, one by one. Then, looking at her with shining eyes, he said, "It's official now, isn't it?" Helen knelt in front of him, tears blurring her vision. "Yes," she whispered. "Now it's our beginning." The news spread quickly among the staff. Some reacted with surprise, others with unease. Sandra remained silent, avoiding Helen more than ever. But Helen didn't seek approval. What she had with Daniel couldn't be measured by job titles. What mattered now was the future. Weeks passed. Edward canceled one of his business trips, and for the first time in years, spent the day at home simply watching. He saw how Daniel learned without fear, how he laughed at language quirks, how he explained grammar with the innocence of a game, not a test. And Edward realized something he had never dared to imagine before, a different future for his son. A future not shaped by medical reports or whispered pity, but by freedom, all because of a woman he had almost overlooked. Months went by, and the Blackwood mansion was no longer the same. Daniel now ran through the corridors carrying notebooks, reciting expressions in French, Japanese, Spanish, and more as if they had always belonged to him. The boy who once lived locked in silence now filled every space with words, with laughter, with life. Edward watched it all with new eyes. He no longer saw his son as a riddle to be solved, but as a living discovery, full of nuance. He still carried guilt he rarely admitted, but now he was present. And for Daniel, presence meant everything. One Friday afternoon, Edward walked into the study room carrying an envelope. Helen noticed the formality, but took it politely. She opened it, read the invitation, and looked up in surprise. "An event?" she asked. "Not just any event," Edward said. "The inauguration of the new educational wing at the Blackwood Foundation. Daniel will be one of the honorees." And you, his voice softened, you'll be the guest of honor. Helen blinked slowly. For a moment, the weight of her past pulled her back lectures, crowded auditoriums, honors long left behind. I'm not one for speeches, she said quietly. You don't have to speak, Edward reassured. But if you want to, the microphone will be yours. The ceremony took place in a beautifully restored old theater. Guests filled the seats. Businessmen, educators, families. But the highlight was a boy walking on stage, hand in hand with the woman who had given him back his voice. The audience rose to its feet, not out of formality, but because Daniel radiated something impossible to ignore. He stepped to the microphone, straightened his paper, and took a deep breath. Good evening. My name is Daniel Blackwood. For a long time, I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't want to, but because no one spoke to me in the right way. Then one day, a woman walked into my life carrying a cleaning rag and a smile. She spoke with her heart. She listened to me before I could make a sound. The theater fell utterly silent. Faces in the crowd glistened with tears. Today, I speak 9 languages. But more important than that, I learned to speak to myself, to understand my own feelings. And all of this happened because someone decided to see me. He turned to Helen and extended his hand. Professor Helen, you taught me more than words. You taught me that even silence can be heard. Thank you. The theater erupted in applause. Helen's tears flowed freely, unashamed. Edward stepped on stage next. He waited for the room to quiet, then spoke. His voice, usually commanding in business, was gentler now. For many years, I believed money could solve anything. I thought giving my son the best doctors, the best programs, was enough. I was blind. What he needed most was already in front of me, and I didn't see it. He turned, pointing toward Helen. This woman came into my house with humility, and without asking for anything, she gave my son back his soul. He paused, his voice catching. Today I finally understand. Value isn't measured by status, nor by credentials, but by the impact we leave on someone's life. And if anyone here still thinks she was just a cleaner, perhaps it's time to relearn the meaning of that word. The audience rose again, this time in reverence. Applause thundered through the hall, long and unrelenting. Backstage afterward, a journalist approached Helen, recorder in hand. Professor, she asked, what do you believe truly changed this boy's story? Helen smiled, serene, no longer carrying the burden of hiding who she was. I didn't change anything. I was simply there when he needed me. Sometimes, what a child needs most is not someone trying to fix them, but someone willing to listen. Across the room, Daniel laughed with other children, switching languages with ease. Edward watched from afar, and for the first time in years, his gaze held not worry but pride. That night, Helen left the theater without fanfare, without spotlights. But with peace in her heart, she had not sought recognition. She had simply wanted to help. And in doing so, she had given a boy his voice and a father his humanity. Sometimes life strips us of everything: people, dreams, direction. But it is in those empty spaces we discover what cannot be taken away. The quiet strength to begin again. The value of being truly seen, and the courage to keep going even when the world forgets who we are. From that night on, life inside the Blackwood mansion was never the same. Daniel continued to flourish, his notebooks filled with words, sketches, and dreams written in 9 different languages. He no longer drifted silently through the halls. He filled them with laughter, with questions, with songs. Edward, too, was no longer the man he once was. He began leaving work earlier, choosing dinners at home over late meetings, walking with Daniel in the garden, sitting quietly through lessons just to listen. He was still learning how to be present, still healing from years of distance, but step by step, he was becoming the father his son had always needed. And Helen, she never sought the spotlight. She lived simply, teaching Daniel with the same quiet devotion she had shown from the very beginning. Yet in the stillness of the study room, surrounded by colored cards and worn-out books, she found herself again not the grieving widow, not the forgotten cleaner, but the teacher she was born to be. Her past pain hadn't vanished. The losses she endured would always be part of her. But now, those wounds carried purpose. Through Daniel's voice, her own was reborn. Sometimes destiny hides behind ordinary disguises, a rag, an apron, a forgotten song. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't look like miracles at all. They look like two people sitting on the floor of a library, whispering words back and forth until silence itself begins to break. Helen had once been invisible. Daniel had once been voiceless. But together, they reminded the world of a truth money could never buy. That love listens, patience heals, and language, when spoken from the heart, can build bridges where walls once stood. And so, a boy found his voice, a father found his humanity, and a woman who thought her story had ended discovered it was only just beginning.